like Native Americans and Native Canadians, many of them will have, these kind of stories as well.
Right, and this is something I should have said, and it is rude for me not to have said. But of course, there were fairies before Europeans ever settled in these areas. There were local fairies, and every so often you get these fascinating overlaps. For example, in England, famous one of the most famous fairy place names. There are lots of places with this name. Is the Fairy Hole. And a fairy hole would be typically a cavern where fairies lived. And in Nova Scotia, there's a very famous cave. I believe it's in the north of Nova Scotia, but please, please don't be angry. I've got this wrong. And in that cave, presumably there was this idea that fairies dwelt. To call it the fairy hole is a very British way of referring to it. And yet we also know that local Indian legends talked about stone gnomes living in this cave. And
Wow.
so what seems to have happened there is that the local European population were talking to First Nation storytellers, discovered that this cave was a place that had Indian fairies, and gave it a name that would have not been out of place in lowland Scotland or northern England.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's fascinating that, these tales already existed here before any Europeans arrived in
Yeah,
North
no,
America. The
absolutely.
fact that,
Yeah.
and it's like that, it makes you wonder, like how can we explain that? I mean, just that
I,
we have similar ideas of myth all across, humans. We that nature sparks our imagination in similar ways, or is there something happening out
is this
there?
something happening? I would challenge you to find anywhere in the world, any human community, I should say, that at some point in its history has not had fairy beliefs of some kind. The idea that there is this parallel community living outside our own. Um, Now, again, how you explain this is interesting. Is this a belief which has just always been with us? I mean, some of the best modern studies on religion suggest that if you go back to the very earliest human communities or their modern representative, hunter gatherers, the one thing that the vast majority have in common is what's typically called animism, this idea that the inanimate world around us has spirits within it. So, again, this is something which I think you would find in one way or another everywhere.
I've got a question from Pete. He's one of my subscribers on Patreon. Pete says, "Hello, Dr. Young. I hope you are doing well. I have a couple of questions for you. I'd like to hear more on your thoughts about the Theosophists and whether you think that ultimately they did more harm than good to fairy folklore, both in terms of active fairy folk belief and academic study." That's his first question. So I'll
Right.
with that one, and then I'll get to the next one.
Okay, so first of all, let's just talk about theosophy because I imagine that there are some people listening who've never heard of this. In the mid 19th century in the United States, um, uh, spiritualism started to become a mass movement. Spiritualism, of course, it is the idea that by sitting around a table or being together with people, but especially what we would call a medium, it was possible to contact other realities and particularly the dead.
Sort of like
Um,
a seance type thing?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the seance is born out of spiritualism, and theosophy, in a sense, is a wing of this idea of spiritualism that creates an entire mythology, an entire description of the world, based around an understanding that the world is spiritual and that there are different forces that we can contact.
Mhm.
Now, what's interesting and the reason the Theosophists matter so much in the history of fairies is the following reason. The Theosophists, spiritualists, were interested above all in the dead. They were interested in our beloved departed, granddad who died. We can sit down in a dark room and talk to this person. Theosophists said, yes, that's true, but you can also interact with other spirits that are not human souls. And Theosophists said these are what have traditionally been called fairies. And so they created they created, really, I would call it a new mythology of fairies. And this linked in often to this Victorian idea of the sugar plum fairy. Theosophist fairies are often much sweeter and kinder than traditional fairies. And the other thing about theosophist fairies is, in theosophy, there's this very, very strong idea that fairies are natural forces. In other words, that every plant has its own fairy, and that fairy is what allows the plant to grow. And this is something that, if you sit down with your children and watch Tinkerbell cartoons today,
Mhm.
the Disney Tinkerbell series. I mean, in some ways, wonderful cartoons, but it's just it's the cartoon version of Theosophy, because these fairies go around managing the natural world, whereas that's not actually what we hear about from fairies earlier on in history. So if some of your listeners have this idea that fairies are, I have a rose bush outside the window of the room where I am now, a theosophist would say, well, there are fairies in your garden because the fairies will look after this rose bush.
Right.
This idea is not really there in earlier fairy lore. There are hints of it, and there are hints that fairies help the seasons,
Right.
but it's not mainstream. Whereas in theosophy, it really, really is important. And when we look at fairies in children's fiction today or films, they are almost always the theosophist version of fairies. Now, your question was saying, is this a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I have my own, let's say, aesthetic views on this, but what I would say is that when you're dealing with folklore and beliefs like this, in the end, you don't get to say whether it's good or bad. These ideas have gone mainstream. They're there. And when people see fairies today, they very often see theosophy fairies. And for me, there's just no arguing with that. It's the way that folklore, it's the way that ideas about the supernatural develop. And we may find some of those more or less attractive personally.
Mhm.
And I'm not a big fan of theosophy or theosophical fairies, but it's something that's become real. It's just part of the texture of modern fairy belief.
And actually that really segues well into his next question, which is, do you think that pop culture has bled too much into fairy lore, shaping perceptions of the other folk and influencing encounters? Or do you think that pop culture is keeping fairies alive in an age where they may have disappeared from cultural memory long before? Thanks for
Yeah,
that. Sorry, go.
yeah, no, these are excellent questions. Um, I instinctively, when I heard you read out that question, you read the first part and then you read the second part, and as you were reading the second part, part of me inside shouted, "Yes, that's it." And I have three daughters, and not only obviously I have day-to-day contact with them, but I also have contact through them with a much wider circle of children, and I've seen the way that fairy lore has remained alive, thanks to thanks to popular culture. And purists, and in a sense I am a purist, purists might be irritated by the version of fairies we get, but I think I would be, something is better than nothing. And for me, it's very valuable that my children watch Tinkerbell cartoons and grow up with ideas of fairies, that they have access to these magical worlds. And maybe later on they will have a chance to explore other ideas of fairies. But I guess I'm kind of, part of me is a snob and looks down on this stuff, but part of me thinks I'm glad that fairies are there in popular culture, because it really gives access to new generations who are interested in these things. And I think one of the great dangers the modern Western world faces is that we become too materialistic. We leave behind everything that's spiritual. I mean, in the last century, there has been a retreat from God and belief in God, which is really just extraordinary.
Mm.
And I think that any chance our children get to have any hint, even of something transcendental, something that is beyond us, something that is spiritual, is a good thing, because this is part of the human makeup, and it's it's very dangerous to cut people off from that entirely.
Do you think that there's a sense in which we need to, in some way, believe in the fairies in order for them to continue to exist? I mean, definitely in our own imaginations, but I'm just thinking about Peter Pan and,
Oh yes.
that moment from the play where Tinker Bell is in trouble, and then they say to the children, "You need to clap if you believe in fairies." And this is what brings her back, and I was thinking about another, just because we're talking about pop culture. I was thinking about another old movie, The Never Ending Story. I don't know if you know that one.
Yes, I watched it with my children recently.
Oh, yeah, they it's sort of an alternate fairy world that that whole story takes place in, and the Nothing is taking over this fairy
Yes, yeah.
world, and it's because people are no longer believing in it, and this is what is destroying it. Do you think that we sort of have that sense about the fairies, and also that we kind of look back on the people from the past and their beliefs almost kind of wistfully, that they lived in a more magical time, and that children live in a more magical existence where these beliefs are more real to them.
Well, I'm going to answer this question, and I'm not sure I'm really answering it entirely in the spirit that you want me to. But the way I look at this is, I think that I grew up in the countryside. I grew up on a farm when I was very young. And I live now on the edge of the countryside. I go into the countryside every day. And I think we're becoming rapidly, we've gone from being human beings who farmed the land, or before that, who hunted over the land. We've gone from human beings who did this to being industrial human beings, and now we're becoming digital human beings, to the extent where so much of our lives actually takes place on the internet or in cyberspace. And I think one of the great things about fairies is fairies are a way. I mean, let's just say for a second that fairies are not real, that they're just something that we've created for ourselves to relate to the world. Even if you reduce fairies just to that, the extraordinary value that fairies have, and this is particularly true, I think, with children, is to reconnect ourselves with the wilds around us. Because, and I think this is another problem with the modern world,
Yeah.
is that most of us just live. We don't have a day-to-day relationship with the countryside around us. Maybe if we're enthusiastic, once a week we go out for a walk in the countryside or something like this. And what I like, one of the reasons I think fairies appeal to me is because fairies are calling us back to this reality that is non-human in the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. Because there are so many things that I still feel that, even with our all of our scientific advancements, that we don't understand, and I don't want to give up that idea of.
But if I can just chip in there, you say that there are some things that with all our scientific understandings we don't get. What really terrifies me is it's because of our scientific understandings we don't get some of these things. In other words, there are some things that we've actually started to lose touch with, things that our ancestors a century ago would have found quite natural. And I think that any chance that we have to reconnect, not necessarily to come up with answers, but just to be aware that there are problems and issues there. Anything that helps us do that is a good thing.
I'm going to shift focus slightly. I wanted to ask you about the connection between fairies and ghosts. We've talked a bit about ghosts, but in a lot of the particularly Irish stories that I've read, you find fairies, sort of with ghosts. Somebody will find themselves among a fairy dance or something like that, and then they'll see, their cousin that died last year who's there dancing with the fairies. what's the relationship there?
Right. This is a question. This is another of these questions that bothers me. That again, I don't quite lie awake at night thinking about it, but it's something I've never really got my head around. And all I can say to you is this: that particularly when you think of Britain, there isn't much by way of stories like this where um, people interrelating with the fairies come across the dead, or at least because they're not necessarily dead. Sometimes they've just been stolen by the fairies.
Mm.
However, in Ireland, it's a big issue, and we talked before about the famous Bridget Cleary case, where this poor woman was burnt because her family believed she was a fairy, and her husband was prepared to act on that information. But there were some amazing cases from Ireland from the 1860s, 1870s, where people would interact with the fairies because they believed that their kin had died and gone to the fairies, or they believed that their kin had been stolen and taken to the fairies. And so these two things definitely wrap around each other. And some people, there's a famous Scottish folklorist called Lewis Spence. Lewis Spence argued that the fairies are our ancestors, that the fairies are this parallel community of the dead that share the landscape with us. And I think the only answer I would give to this, and for your listeners, is that it's possible that 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, this was true in Neolithic times. But at least the way that fairies are seen in historic times, this was not usually the case. And that it's important to say that in these Irish stories you're talking about, there's always a very clear difference between fairies and their human prisoners or human spirits who live with them. And in a sense, fairies take on the role of angels in paradise. They're guardians, sometimes prison guardians. I mean, it's not always necessarily very pleasant, of these human spirits, but they don't seem to be the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, I think it does, and I think, I mean, in the stories that I've read, it almost seems like people think that, or people used to think that fairies were almost a type of ghost, or that a ghost that had taken on these extra magical features. Like, I know in certain Japanese stories, you have these ideas that if like the fox fairy, the kitsune, I can probably not pronouncing that right, where
Right.
the fox has lived for so long that it gains extra abilities or powers. Maybe there could be something going on there similar with the beliefs, but that were there in Ireland. But I think it's hard to pick them apart now because we just have the stories themselves rather than people explaining what they felt about them. You know?
But I think if you go back to Ireland again in the 19th century, I mean, there we have something much better than stories. We have judicial cases, we have legal cases where people actually ended up in court, typically because a woman, and it was usually a woman, had convinced the local community that she was in contact with the fairies, and that she could also bring back human spirits from the fairy world. And these people were prosecuted by the British government, which of course controlled Ireland at that date, as I mean, what's the word we would use today? I suppose as confidence tricksters.
Mhm.
Um, and I probably in some senses they were, but there's one extraordinary case from near Waterford in Ireland. I believe it's from the 1860s, where a woman managed to convince the local policeman and a series of other people that she was able to bring back human spirits from the fairy world, and they had to give her food because by giving them human food, she was able to bring these spirits back.